Hello everyone and welcome to the first game we'll be showing from Airthings Masters, the second stage of the Champions Chess Tour. And again, it's a 12-player event with some of the players from the first event, some of them are new. We're going to discuss that a bit later on, and it's everything as usual. They are fighting for a lot of money. $60,000 is the first place, and again, it's a rapid tournament, so 15 minutes per player, and you get some increment. I think it's 10 seconds increment from starting from move 1, and of course, no draw offers allowed before move 40. So first 3 days will be the preliminaries, and then we go into the knockout phase of the tournament. So without further ado, let's check it out. It's a nice game from round 1, Magnus Carlsen versus Levon Aronian. So let's see what happens. Magnus, with the white pieces, opens with d4. We have knight to f6 by Levon, c4, we have e6, knight to f3, and d5. The queen's gambit declined is on the board. Knight to c3 and bishop to b4. Levon goes for the Ragozin defense, and now a nice captures, and bishop to f4. Magnus plays this very often. c6 and now e3. So both players just defending their central pawns. We have bishop to f5 and now queen to b3. The Levon already had this position against Le Quang Liam last year in the Superbet Blitz, where bishop to e2 was played and that game ended in a draw. Here Magnus tries queen to b3, goes after the bishop, also tries to get Levon to take the knight here on c3, but Levon just goes queen to b6, which means he most likely is interested in a queen trade. So knight to h4 by Magnus, going after the bishop, and here Levon retreats with bishop to e6. There is one game in the database. Harika Duronavali played it against Barry Neal in 2015 PokerStars Isle of Man Stars Championship, where bishop to g6 was played, but here bishop to e6 is a new move. Bishop to g6 is a new move. So already as of move 9 we have a completely new game, and this is basically where our game starts. So Magnus eliminates the bishop, captures, and now just goes h3 as the h file opened up now for Levon's rook. So it makes sense to play h3, also take away the g4 square from Levon's knight. Knight b to d7, continuing development, preparing to castle queenside, and bishop to d3 now. Magnus also continues developing pieces, and c5. Levon now strikes in the center and says that he's now ready to go queenless. So a3, attacking the bishop, and now bishop to a5. You could also capture on c3. If you're not interested in a queen trade, then maybe the queen would capture. But here we have queen back to a5, and now the queen trade is offered. So Magnus, of course, trades. Queen captures, we have bishop captures, and d captures on c5. We have knight captures on c5, attacking the bishop, and here Magnus just castles. You'd think maybe bishop to c2 is a good move because it also covers the b3 square, but it's not a problem because after castles, for example, knight to b3 check, king c2, the knight has to go back, so there's no need to actually prevent the knight from coming to c2, which is sometimes useful. Sometimes you think, oh no, I really don't want my opponent's piece to get to that square, but then if you look into it, then you realize it's perfectly fine. So maybe you just allow it and he plays a bad move. So here 11 castles also, and now comes king to b1. A nice prophylactic move by Magnus, and 11 cannot do such a thing because the bishop covers this square. So Carlsen's king is a bit safer there. So knight to e6, of course Levon wants to deal with this bishop threat, and bishop to e5. Of course Magnus not interested in trading, it's a wonderful bishop. So bishop to c7, Levon now forces the trade. So bishop captures, we have king captures, and bishop back to c2. Now Magnus wants to organize an attack against the d5 pawn. He wants to play bishop to b3, add another attacker here, and just g5. When you have doubled pawns such as these, you want to advance your doubled pawn, because then if Magnus pushes anything forward, you can just trade it, you get rid of your doubled pawn, and then your position is fine again. So bishop to b3. Most of the times. And now, as the pawn is attacked 3 times, just king c6, 11 defends it. We have rook to c1, now threatening some nasty discoveries, and of course 11 brings the king to the center, king to d6. And although it looks scary, for example, rook hd1 looks scary, but the pawn is sufficiently defended. It's defended 3 times and attacked 3 times. Not much for you to look forward to. e4 kind of is the threat, but king e5 and 11 will survive this. So Magnus goes for a different line. He says, all right, I can't do anything about the d5 pawn for the moment. I'm going to go grab a pawn on a7. And Levon doesn't seem to be bothered by losing this pawn. So knight b5 check, we have king to e5, and now knight captures on a7. So Magnus grabs a pawn, Levon has a very active king, so let's see what happens. Knight to e4, Levon goes after the f2 pawn, and knight back to b5. Grabbing the f2 pawn now is possible, but then you kind of have to deal with rook to f1, and it's hard to see where this is going. So first we have g4, trying to get the h file to open up, and now rook to c2. Here Magnus defends the f2 pawn as Levon missed his chance to grab it, and now comes rook to h5. Sorry, not h4, rook to h5. Levon now is preparing to double up on the h file. So f3, kicking the knight away from such an active square, g captures, pawn captures, and knight to g3 now. And now you have to give up control of the h3 pawn, because there's no way to keep it. If rook h2 h2, just knight f1 attacks the rook and the e3 pawn, so not a lot of fun. So rook to d1 instead by Magnus, and now knight to f5. Going after the e3 pawn first, there's always time to capture on h3. So rook to c3 defending, and now Levon still doesn't go after the pawn. First knight to e7. Now he can advance these pawns. The knights nicely control all of these squares, so he's very safe even with his king all the way on e5. So here knight to c7. Of course Magnus wants to infiltrate the 7th rank with the rook, so he wants to trade knights, and g5. So here we have knight captures on e6, and Levon says, okay, thank you, f captures on e6. He strengthens his center. The d5 pawn is nicely protected now, and he will now deal with the h3 pawn. And here Magnus goes for the active rook to c7. e4 was also a possibility, because you cannot capture the rook with hang, but then you also have to take this into consideration. But then the e6 pawn is weak, so it's a bit of a trade-off. So here rook to c7 by Magnus, and now knight to f5. Again, going after this e3 pawn, and only now e4 by Magnus. So, of course, you still cannot capture the rook with hang, so knight to d4, now attacking the bishop on b3, and here just rook captures on b7. Rook to c3 is kind of the engine's recommendation, as it's the safest move, but Magnus goes for the tricky rook captures on b7, and here he allows Levon to take the upper hand, but Levon goes for rook captures on h3, which is the correct move, but not the correct move in the correct move order. Rook captures on h3 is fine, but it doesn't come with a threat. If you first play d captures on e4, Magnus recaptures, and then you play rook captures on h3, then rook captures on h3 comes with a threat, as the bishop on b3 would now be attacked twice. Magnus would have to deal with it, and then you can either pick up the pawn, start pushing your passed pawn, and so on. So it's a very, very simple idea, but you know, makes all the difference in the world. But like I said, they're playing a 15 minutes per player, so of course you cannot spend all the time on your moves. So Levon captures on h3, and now Magnus, of course, trades on d5. Captures, we have captures, and rook to e7 check now. Getting the king away from the knight, but king to d6 also comes with an attack on the rook. So, of course, you have to move the rook. Rook e3, and now knight captures on b3. Capturing the pawn here doesn't make all that much sense, because you lose the d5 pawn. So instead, knight captures on b3. We have rook captures on b3, and now rook to f8. A double attack on the f3 pawn, Levon trying to win his pawn back, and rook d to d3. The pawn is now nicely defended, and Magnus is up a pawn in a double rook endgame. Maybe he can start pushing those two connected pawns. So rook to f4, and now, of course, preventing this a4 idea. So king c2, Magnus starts improving the position of his king. King to e5, Levon does the same, and now rook to b5, putting pressure on the pawn here. And now Levon needs to decide what to do here, whether to capture or to defend. Levon defends with rook to d4, but unfortunately for Levon, this rook to d4 idea loses the game. So feel free to pause the video here and beat Levon while I give you a couple of seconds. Also, my dad got me this cool King USB stick for Christmas, so you can check that out while you're thinking. let me just put that back in. See, it's a very nice USB stick king thingy, 32 gigabytes no less. But yeah, for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on beating 11 Aronian in this position. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, it's f4 with check. And now the problem is the rook on h3 hangs. G captures on h4 and rook captures on h3. Amazingly, Magnus did not play this. Like I said, it's a 15-minute rapid game, and they were both very low on the clock. So instead, after this rook to d4 move, after rook to d4, Magnus just captured the rook. And this is, unfortunately, as you'll see, not enough. So king captures on d4 and rook to b3 now, defending the pawn. But it's not a problem. Rook h2 check, king to b1, and now rook back to h3, defending the pawn. We have king to a2, and now comes king to c4. Again, putting pressure on the rook. Rook to c3 check, king to b5, and now king to b3, preparing to push the pawn. So d4, Levon attacks the rook, rook to d3, and now king c5, really making it hard for Magnus to push those past pawns. King to c2, now maybe Magnus can start pushing, rook to g3. We have a4 by Magnus, and now rook to g2 with check. Rook to d2 defending, and again rook to g3, Levon threatening to pick up the f3 pawn. Rook back to f2, now defending the pawn from behind, and now king to b4, attacking the a4 pawn. And even though Magnus is up a pawn, Levon's king is much more active, and Magnus is not able to further advance those pawns. So here, Levon finds a very sneaky idea. g4, now you have to capture, or maybe you don't, maybe you can push f4. It's very interesting because it comes with a pawn sacrifice, and then you continue pushing your pawn, but it's not enough. d3 check, king to c1, and now king c3 is super dangerous. f6, rook a3, threatening checkmate, so you have to prevent that. King b2, king b1, and now d2 is just game over. You'd have to defend with rook f1, rook captures on a4, and then we can even play this out, f7, and the fancy rook to f4 wins the game for black, because you either get rid of this pawn or rook captures, and it's a nice checkmate. Queen check, you go here, queen check, you go here, queen to b2 is checkmate. So very interesting, but f4 does not work for Magnus. So Magnus goes f captures and g4, d3, a nice zwischenzug before recapturing, king to d2, and now rook captures on g4. And now the other pawns will fall as well. King captures on d3, rook to g3 check first, king to c2, and now rook to c3 with check. Levon even wants to pick up the b3 pawn with check if king b2 is played. So king b1, rook captures on b3 with check, rook to b2, and here we have a nice clean board. Rook captures, and king captures on a4. So yeah, really wild game, but that's what happens in pretty much every round, since you know, it's not classical chess, it's rapid chess, and I know you guys enjoy lower time controls much more than you do classical chess, because that's like, I don't know if we could go back to all that many classical tournaments now, because well, it's like 3 rounds with all the games drawn. I don't know, it'd be it's of course much more precise chess, but it's not as exciting. So yeah, Levon did give him a chance here after this rook to d4 move, but that's just it. You do not expect Levon to make a mistake like this, so of course you do not realize f4 and you pick up the rook. So always expect the unexpected. But yeah, that's the game. I do hope you guys enjoyed it. We're going to check out a few more games, and then we're going to discuss the standings. If you have your favorite, use hashtag suggestion, and I will check it out. I would like to thank Moritz Koslin, Reinder Hoikers, Tin Le, Ryan Goggins, and John Nelson for a contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of the Airthings Masters, checking up on your wonderful suggestions and whatever happens in the chess world. So thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.